Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kari. So maybe one of your reading goals this year was to read more classics, or maybe you've already read a few classics but you don't know what to read next, and maybe you're intimidated by all the choices out there. People talk about classics all the time, but it's really easy to get intimidated because of all the choices and being intimidated thinking that you're not going to understand the classics. Today I'm going to recommend you 13 classics that I think you should start with if you're not sure where to begin with classics and you're feeling a little intimidated by all the choices out there. The first book that I'm going to recommend you is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was published in 1938, so it's really not that old. It's not even 100 years old yet. So that's going to help a lot with the language. A lot of times if you go too far back into the classics, the language gets kind of difficult. So for example, if you're going to Victorian literature right away, I would not recommend that just because of the level of the writing. It's a bit too difficult if you're just beginning in classics. So I would recommend that you start with more modern classics and work your way backwards. So Rebecca is an excellent place to start. This follows our unnamed protagonist who's on vacation in Monte Carlo with the woman that she works for. While she's in Monte Carlo, she meets Maxim de Winter, this really wealthy Englishman. The unnamed protagonist comes from a modest background, so she's really taken with Maxim's lifestyle and his charisma. During their vacation in Monte Carlo, they fall in love, and Maxim invites her to move back to England with him. Now Maxim lives in a really famous house called Manderley, and actually the incipit, or the first line of this book, refers to Manderley. It's, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." So that's a really famous first line. And so this book is actually the protagonist explaining to us what has happened to her previously in her love story with Maxim. Because once she arrives at Manderley with Maxim, that's when she learns that Maxim was previously married to a woman named Rebecca. And Rebecca's presence is just everywhere. And so the protagonist is slowly finding out what happened to Maxim's ex-wife, and she constantly feels her presence in the house. If you're a fan of Gothic literature, you have to read this. If you really like eerie stories and you're not sure if things are supernatural or not, really I cannot recommend this to you more. It's an excellent read, and like I said, the language is very easy to understand because it's really not that old. Don't be intimidated by the size because it looks like it's long, but really it reads super quickly. So this was the first recommendation, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Another piece of advice I would give you if you're just starting in classics is to read short stories. That way you can get a taste of the author's writing or writing from that time period without committing to a really big book and risking not even finishing it. But with a short story, you can commit to it, sit down, and read it in one sitting. With that being said, my next recommendation is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Even though this was published in 1892, it doesn't read like a typical 19th century text because, again, the language is very accessible. This short story is about a woman who is married to her husband and they live in this new house, but she stays in the attic part of the house. It's never really referenced to as an attic, but we can understand that it is the attic. And the woman's husband is having her stay in this room in order to protect her because according to him she's having a mental break. So if we understand a little bit of history about this time, that's when a lot of women were being, I'll say, diagnosed with hysteria. Hysteria was just a really covert way to say emotional. Anytime women really showed their emotions or had opinions about something, men would diagnose them with hysteria. So the protagonist in this story, we can understand that she's been diagnosed with hysteria, but it's never said. The word hysteria is never said. This is told in first person, so we get a first-hand view at the thoughts that she's having and understanding the things that her husband has said to her and the fact that he's gaslighting her into believing that she's crazy and that this is all for her own good. Actually, this short story is based on things that happened to the author during her lifetime. This is really a foundational feminist text, and if you're interested in feminist texts, I think this could be even more interesting for you, and if you look into the history of hysteria, it makes it even better. This is a great classic to jump into because, like I said, it's a short story and the language is not difficult to understand. It also connects really well to Rebecca because this is also a really gothic story and you're not sure if things are supernatural or not. My next recommendation are actually 3 books from the same author, and that's the author Shirley Jackson. I would specifically recommend these 3 stories. So I have The Haunting of Hill House, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and the short story The Lottery. So first let's talk about The Lottery because this is a short story. Now my edition here is a collection of short stories by Shirley Jackson, but I would highly recommend The Lottery in particular. Again, because this is a short story, it's an excellent way to get a taste of Shirley Jackson's writing and see if you like it, and then potentially you can move on to the next 2 books from her that I'm going to recommend. This short story takes place in a small American town, and as the title suggests, there's a lottery involved. Every family in town must participate in this annual tradition. I really can't say too much more than that since this is a short story, but just know this isn't like your typical lottery. This is an excellent place to start if you're curious about Shirley Jackson's writing. I would also recommend We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Now this one is a novel, but it's very short. I think it's about 150 pages, so you could definitely binge this in a day, maybe even after you read The Lottery. story. This story is about two sisters, Maricat and Constance, who live together in their house with their uncle Julian. At the beginning of the story, we understand that the rest of their family was poisoned and killed, and so the three of them were the only ones to survive what happened. However, the rest of the town thinks that this family is cursed and that they're witches and do everything possible to stay away from them. The kids in the town taunt them whenever they see them. Whenever Maricat goes to the grocery store, for example, she's constantly getting ridiculed and teased by the children in town, but also the adults. They live a very isolated life because of all this. Uncle Julian is my favorite character in the story because he's really like the comic relief to an otherwise really claustrophobic story. Now, when I say claustrophobic, I mean that in the best way possible. You really feel the atmosphere of Shirley Jackson's writing. She does an excellent job of making you feel uneasy. The conflict of the story happens when their cousin shows up one day and trying to figure out what does he want? Why is he here? I would highly, highly recommend this one. And the third Shirley Jackson that I would recommend for beginners is The Haunting of Hill House. This story follows Eleanor, who has been chosen by someone called Dr. Montague, who is like an expert in supernatural activity. And this Dr. Montague has chosen a handful of people to go examine Hill House with him because there's rumors that it's haunted. And the people that have been chosen to go examine it with him have all claimed to have supernatural experiences. So this story follows all the characters in Hill House and trying to figure out, is Hill House haunted or not? So like I said, I would really recommend Shirley Jackson if you're just beginning with classics because they're very accessible. They're very easy to understand. If you like Gothic stories, it's really the perfect place for you to start with classics. And I even think that this is a good order to read them in, to start with the short story, The Lottery, and then the novel, but it's a short novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and then to read The Haunting of Hill House. The next classic that I'm going to recommend for beginners is The Collector by John Fowles. This was published in 1963, so again, this is a modern classic. If you like to read thrillers, you have to start with this classic. You're going to love this, especially if you like things like You by Carroll and Kepnes. So this follows Frederick, and he likes to collect butterflies. And then one day he notices this beautiful art student named Miranda, and he starts to follow her around and admire how beautiful she is, almost like he follows around his butterflies and admires how beautiful they are. Then one day he decides that he wants to collect Miranda just as he collects butterflies and keep her for himself. That's all I can really say about this one, but like I said, if you enjoyed You by Carroll and Kepnes, you're gonna love this. This is basically the prototype. I would highly recommend for thriller lovers who want to get into classics. If I hadn't told you this was published in 1963, you would have thought that this was published last year. Next is a book that gets talked about a lot, and I think that that makes it even more intimidating for people just because they hear it talked about so often. They think, oh, this is some grand literary work that I'm not going to understand. However, that's not true at all. And with that being said, I would highly recommend 1984 by George Orwell. This was published in 1949, so again, the language is not difficult to understand. I think that this is especially interesting to read right now because of the things that the world has gone through the past about 6 years or so. It's more relevant than ever. Don't let the fact that people talk about this book all the time intimidate you. It's very easy to read, and it will keep you on the edge of your seat. Once I read this one, I regretted that I waited so long to read it. I wish someone would have forced me to read it sooner than I did. This book is like the ultimate dystopian novel. We follow the main character, Winston, who works for the Ministry of Truth. And the Ministry of Truth is in charge of basically censoring things and making sure that people don't have access to the things that the government doesn't want them to have access to. They even go so far as to delete words from the dictionary so that those words don't exist anymore, and therefore people can't think about them anymore. So for example, if you delete the word protest from the dictionary, eventually that word will stop to exist, and if you can't think the word protest, then people won't do the act of protesting because it's like it doesn't exist anymore. And if you don't have the language for an act, then that act can't happen anymore. But Winston starts to get really frustrated with the Ministry of Truth and starts to doubt if the work that he's doing is the right thing for society after all. So this book follows Winston's journey and his doubts that he starts to have about the government and what he does about it. This is super relevant to the things that are going on in today's world, and I think you would be able to draw so many parallels and find it extra interesting because of current events. The language is very modern, and I don't think you're going to be able to put it down. Also, I just want to say, if you've read Animal Farm by George Orwell, but not this one, personally, I love 1984 1,000 times more than Animal Farm, so if you didn't like Animal Farm, really don't be intimidated to pick up 1984. I think you're gonna like it. Another great way to get into classics is to read plays. It's the same idea as a short story. Since plays can only be a couple hours long, the play can only take a couple hours to read. So with that in mind, I would recommend Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Edward Albee. This first premiered in 1962. This play is composed of two couples, so therefore there's 4 characters in this play. The first couple is a middle-aged couple, Martha and George. The second couple is younger, and that's Nick and Honey. George and Nick both work at the university, and so George is kind of trying to take Nick under his wing and invites Nick and his wife over for drinks after a faculty meeting one night. Now, Martha and George have a lot of marital problems, and they like to argue and play games with each other. They're very snarky and sarcastic to each other, but then Nick and Honey kind of get swept away into the banter of Martha and George. It's kind of like a cat and mouse game that Martha and George start to play with Nick and Honey for their benefit. It's really a funny play and really witty. I would definitely recommend this for people who want to get into classics but want to try something kind of short. The next book is another dystopian, which I think is a really great genre for beginners to get into because they read so fast and they really pique your interest. And that's The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So this is another modern classic. It was published in 1985. So there's no worries about the language. Margaret Atwood is still alive today. She's still writing today. So she writes like we write. Now, obviously, because this was published in 1985 and she is still alive, I guess this would be considered more of a modern classic. And I'm very confident that this is going to become a classic. So this story starts in a world very much like our own. But then a totalitarian government takes over the current government, kills all the senators, kills the president, and puts in place their own government. And the new government decides to call this country that they've created Gilead. Now, in this dystopian world, it has become very difficult for women to have children, and not very many women are capable of having children anymore. So in this government, they've rounded up all the women who are capable of having children and distributed them out to families of men who rule the government. This way, all the leaders of Gilead are able to have children. So there's definitely a content warning for rape in this, because the commanders ceremoniously rape the handmaids, aka the women who are capable of having children, in order to impregnate them so that they can have a baby, because their wife is incapable of having a baby. So this book follows one of those handmaids, June, and all the things that she experiences as a handmaid. Again, kind of like 1984, I think the interest with dystopian is that there's still a little hint of today's society that we can connect to. So obviously, maybe you've seen people use the handmaid's costume to protest abortion rights, for example. There's always a little hint of something realistic in dystopians that make it feel extra scary because we can kind of see a potential future in it. I would really recommend this for people trying to get into classics because it feels like a very modern book and like it could have been published last year. Another great way to get into classics is to read children's classics. So I would definitely recommend Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Even though technically this is a Victorian text because it was published in 1871, you cannot tell that this is Victorian. Like I said, since this is children's literature, its target audience, after all, is children, so it can't be too complicated. I think that this is a really great book to read because, in my opinion, the genius of Lewis Carroll is underrated. Now, if you've seen the Disney adaptation, you've seen how the language of nonsense is very important to the story. It's actually very smart and uses language in a very interesting way and keeps adult readers interested just as well as young readers. So don't think that Disney oversimplified this story and that you want to understand the book. You would, and I think that you would really enjoy it. The next book is another story that is quite short that I think would be an excellent place to start with classics, and that's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was published in 1925. A lot of people have read this in high school, so you're already kind of familiar with the story. Maybe it was a long time ago and you don't remember the details, but still, you've read it at one point so you have a vague idea, or maybe you've seen a movie adaptation, for example, the adaptation with Leonardo DiCaprio, and that would facilitate your reading of this story. Also, since it's quite short, it's very easy to just sit down and binge it in one day. You don't have to commit to a long story and potentially not like it and have wasted a long time reading a long story. So The Great Gatsby is from the perspective of Nick observing his new neighbor, Jay Gatsby, who has these elaborate parties, and this piques Nick's interest and he wants to learn more about Jay Gatsby. There's a reason that this book is always mentioned when people talk about classics, and you shouldn't be intimidated by that fact. It's because it's really good and very accessible. Maybe after you've tried a few of the shorter things and you're more confident to try something a bit longer, I would recommend Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. Now, do not be intimidated by how big this book is. Really, don't be scared. Also, don't be afraid of the fact that this is a Victorian text. Even though this was published in 1831, it's really not as intimidating as it sounds. The language is actually very accessible and easy to understand, which is not something that you can say about Charlotte Bronte's sister Emily, who published Wuthering Heights. Now, I love Wuthering Heights, but I'm not going to lie to you. Wuthering Heights is kind of difficult to understand. The language is a lot more Victorian. However, Jane Eyre, truly, it's quite simple to understand. You're not going to get lost. Also, you get really attached to Jane as a character, and it makes you want to keep reading to learn more about her. So this story, obviously, it follows Jane Eyre, and we follow her through her whole life. This would be defined as a Bildungsroman because we follow Jane from when she's a young girl to when she is an adult. So the story opens with Jane, who's been adopted by her evil aunts and her cousins because her mom and dad died. And it's kind of like the trope of the evil stepmother, except it's the evil aunt. Then Jane gets the opportunity to go to Lowood School, which is like a boarding school for poor girls. Now, Jane is more than happy to go away to Lowood so that she can get away from her evil aunts and cousins. We follow her for a few years in Lowood, and she even becomes a teacher at Lowood when she gets older. But the story really begins when she gets a job as a governess. She's hired by Mr. Rochester to be the governess of Adele, who is his ward from France. There's actually a lot of French references in this book because Charlotte Brontë spoke French. She was actually a teacher in Belgium for a while. Now again, don't take that to mean that this book is difficult, that there's going to be a bunch of French. There's only a little bit of French because Adele speaks French sometimes, but it's always translated in the text, so don't worry if you don't speak French. And it's really quite rare that we get French sentences, so don't worry. So please don't be intimidated by the size of this book. It's really not as scary as it looks, I promise. And the last book that I'm going to recommend to you today is another short book, and that's A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first book in the Sherlock Holmes series, and it was published in 1887. What's great about this is that if you enjoy this a lot, there's a ton more books afterwards that you can read. Also, they're all quite short, and so you could sit down and binge one story a day if you get really into the Sherlock series. If you like the show Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, you really have to read these stories because each episode is based on one of the books. So for example, this is the first book in the series and it's called A Study in Scarlet. In Sherlock, the first episode is called A Study in Pink. So the show really riffs off the stories of the original Sherlock Holmes. If you like mysteries, you have to read Arthur Conan Doyle because he's like the grandfather of mysteries. So those are my 13 recommendations if you're just starting out reading classics. All the books that I've chosen don't have intimidating language and are very easy to understand for a modern reader. Also, it's a great idea to start with short stories, children's literature, or even plays because they give you a taste of the author's writing or the time period. And then you can see if you like it and you can decide if you want to keep reading from that author or from that time period. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this one in the future. In the comments below, let me know what classic you're looking forward to reading or which one is your favorite. And I'll talk to you again next time. Bye!